Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to the SCSP's AI Expo for National Competitiveness and to our roundtable on AI trust and safety, building trust and safety to AI enabled consumer services. I am Steve Kelly of the Institute for Security Technology. We are a Bay Area-based 501c3 think tank that works on issues at the convergence of technology and security. And also, we are also bridge builders between technologists and policymakers. And so we're very happy to be teamed up with SCSP on this event and to be hosting a conversation on trust and safety. You will see on the big boards, we have a QR code. And if you would like to submit a question to the panel as we discuss, feel free to use that. Hopefully you can do that from your seat. And then Eric, who's at the end of the table here, he's going to be receiving these and screening them. And throughout the conversation, if there's something that's particularly on point, he will interrupt us and insert the question into the conversation. And then also at the end of the event, we hope to have a few minutes available, and we'll go through and Eric will tee us up with a few additional ones. So AI technologies have the potential to optimize and revolutionize a broad range of consumer-facing products and services, but not all organizations that might benefit from these technologies are well postured to manage the resulting trust and safety risks. Given the novelty of this application space and the significant global demand for trustworthy technology solutions, further work is needed to craft targeted risk management interventions across the technology stack. So I am thrilled to welcome our roundtable participants. We have a diverse group of players across the AI space that will share their views on the opportunities, risks, and mitigation strategies. We have folks from kind of your more incumbent technology companies, folks from the consumer electronics side. We have folks from the private investment and also civil society organizations like IST and the Human Rights Campaign. So I'm thrilled to get this conversation kicked off. But I will first introduce very briefly, just by name, organization, and title, our roundtable participants. We do have one whose flight was delayed, and so he'll be joining us any moment now, Omidyar Jaffer. But let me go through real quick. And then I'll have to remember where I've seated people. But starting alphabetically, we have Phil Dawson, the head of AI policy at Armilla AI, on my left. Rehan Ehsan, senior manager of public policy for consumer protection and corporate affairs at Samsung Electronics. And Rehan is over here on my left as well. Ani Gorvokian, director for responsible AI public policy at Microsoft. And so just wave as we go through. Jamil Jaffer, who we will be joined by very soon. He's venture partner and strategic advisor at Paladin Capital Group. He's also a professor at George Mason University at their National Security Institute. Angela McKay, sitting to my right, director of trust and safety partnerships and research at Google. Philip Reiner, my boss, chief executive officer at the Institute for Security and Technology. Var Shankar, executive director at the Responsible AI Institute. Var is over here on my right. Govind Shiv Kumar, director for responsible technology at Omidyar Network, over here. Bel Torek, to my left, senior fellow for AI and tech advocacy at the Human Rights Campaign. Lauren Wagner, senior advisor at the Responsible Innovation Labs, on my left. And Dave Wilner, fellow at Stanford University, and I understand you also advise OpenAI, so to my right. So hopefully this setup works, and the group is able to see what you want to see, and you can get to that QR code. If you can't, feel free to stand up and go, because we do want to hear about your questions as we move through. We're going to run this conversation in 6 distinct moves, kind of dividing up our time, and we're going to start with a conversation on use cases for consumer applications of AI. So, what are some of the ways that AI is being or will soon be incorporated into products and services that directly impact the consumer experience? And we can kind of lay the groundwork here, and then we can begin to work through risks and mitigations and governance and that sort of thing. But I think starting off with the storytelling of what's happening out there and what do we expect in the very near term, I'm going to turn over. For each of these, we're going to have a couple of our panelists lead off with about a minute and a half of just scene setting, and then we'll get into a more free range conversation. So Rayhan and Var are going to lead us off with kind of their thoughts on the matter and some scene setting for us. And so I see, Rayhan, I see your name first. Let's start with you. And by the way, since I haven't gone into much detail at all about each of you, at your first opportunity to speak, feel free to say something more about yourself or your role or your organization or your perspective. A little nugget would be great. And definitely when you're on, the push to talk is on the board there. Rayhan? If you don't see a red light, then you are not on. Then
I see it blinking. The green light's blinking here.
tech support is on the way. And actually, while we're doing this, everybody just make sure that you that yours is working real quick.
Green blink, no red light. Green blink, no red.
Oh, mine is, oh, do
You
I?
have to turn yours off. Aha.
Okay.
Oh, okay, so no two mics at one time, okay. Good to know.
All right, okay. Thanks for kicking us off, Steve. Steve mentioned I'm Rayhan Hassan, Senior Manager of Public Policy at Samsung Electronics. I represent the consumer product side of the business, covering policy issues around privacy, AI, and product safety. And I'm excited to be here today to share some of the fascinating use cases of AI in some of our products. AI integration overall isn't a new concept. It's probably not news for anyone here, but it's constantly evolving and hasn't been as consumer facing as it is right now. We've previously incorporated AI into numerous video and audio processing applications. For examples, our televisions use algorithms to upscale content by analyzing different sort of frames in real time, looking at edges, textures, additional details within the imagery to upscale as needed. And then our smartphones have AI to optimize sensor performance, autofocus, image stabilization. I mean, that'd be like those use cases you probably all seen in the commercials. They're pretty heavily advertised, but in terms of implementing them into our other products or white good products, appliances, our goal is to use AI to improve the consumer experience and interaction with our products. So it's sort of an incremental step going forward. One way we're doing that is through object recognition, which is used in a number of different products. In our refrigerators, the internal camera is able to recognize different sort of food objects that you place in fruits, vegetables, drinks, whatever else, and then creates a live list of the inventory of all the different items that are in your refrigerator. And then using our SmartThings app, you're then able to also just have a live look in to see what's in your refrigerator, or maybe see if someone's taking that sandwich that you've kept an eye on, So that's another, maybe not AI, but another useful use for it. In addition to that, you are then able to add expiration dates to, again, give you an alert, avoid food spillage, and to go a step further based on the inventory of items in your refrigerators. The app can then recommend you recipes that you utilize those ingredients. So be a little more efficient that way. And then if the recipe requires baking, you can transition over into your oven, where our newest ovens have a camera that's mounted at the top and is able to recognize different types of food. So for example, if you're baking a lasagna with certain brownness or doneness, you can then set that brownness in your app, and then the camera is able to give you an alert when you've reached it, so you don't burn your lasagna. My personal opinion is one of the use cases for this will be more just sort of time-lapse videos, maybe Instagram Reels, TikToks, things like that. So some additional purposes there. And then after you've made a mess in your kitchen, making that lasagna, you can use the robotic vacuum, which has, again, a camera mounted in the front, along with other sensors to be able to clean, navigate around obstacles, be able to detect spills and not run over them. Also alert you if if you have pets and they have had an accident, you don't want your vacuum going over that either. So it's able to then alert you for that purpose as well. And then again, navigate around anything else that you've left on the ground. But there are a lot of other use cases I'm looking forward to sharing and hearing some more from our panelists here.
Thank you, Phil.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That was fascinating. The reason I thought of Samsung Electronics to bring you in on this panel was I recently got a washer dryer. It's got AI sensing for the dryer cycle. A lot of it is interesting. Nothing as interesting as your vacuum cleaner example and the oven example. But let's go over to VAR from the Responsible AI Institute, because you've got a number of stakeholder organizations and you're developing use cases that you can then move towards ways to test and evaluate. So maybe you can speak to some that go beyond the consumer electronics, and feel free to share a little something about yourself.
Now?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I'm Bar Shankar. I am the Executive Director of the Responsible AI Institute. I am a corporate lawyer by background, helped co-develop the Kaggle AI ethics course, and have been at the Institute for coming up on 3 years. And the Responsible AI Institute is an independent nonprofit organization. We help organizations of different sizes and different industries develop and scale their responsible AI programs, kind of in consultation with the right stakeholders. So I'll just add to a few kind of buckets of use cases that we see typically. Two of them are cross-cutting and two of them are kind of industry-based. So one that's cross-cutting is using LLMs to automate your customer service inquiries. And we're seeing kind of almost, every mature organization picks this as one of their first use cases because they typically have good help desk data already available where they've already had their kind of customer service representative answer questions. And so kind of connecting that up in a modular way and using it to either help your customer service team respond to inquiries or to kind of automate some of that response. A second kind of cross-cutting one is personalized advertising. So a typical use case here is just using generative AI to create options for advertising campaigns. So let's say you use some sort of mascot or logo, and you want to kind of customize it for different demographics of people, different geographies. And so kind of having that as an initial option creator. It can also be much more fine-grained when you get into advertising on social media and kind of use cases like that. We don't work on social media use cases, so I'll let kind of others on the panel speak to the risks there, but that's an area where personalized advertising is used as well. Moving now to the more kind of specific use cases, we are doing a pilot with Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City on skin disease detection using smartphones. And so, if you catch a skin lesion, malignant skin lesion early, it's kind of better to catch it early. And a number of apps have kind of popped up that can help you do this with your smartphone. And so we're trying to integrate some of our work developing assessments with kind of authoritative guidance from dermatologists on what good looks like in deploying those apps. And then finally, in banking, so the kind of financial services industry is a leader in this AI space and in many cases in responsible AI. And so typical use cases there are kind of prompting customer service representatives on what their next conversation with a customer should be. Or for the more advanced companies, we saw, for example, JP Morgan release Index GPT, I think last week, which it helps provide recommendations for institutional investors who are kind of interested in a particular theme It scans all the news articles kind of on the internet and tells the institutional investors, here are some companies that you might not have heard of that are active in this space. They're very advanced use cases being brought to market in the financial services industry. So maybe I'll pause there and would love to hear from others.
Excellent. And let me introduce, since Jamil, your flight arrived. Thank you for making the heroic effort to fly here from San Francisco and stand back this afternoon. And so we introduced you earlier, and as you have your first opportunity to speak, just share a little bit more about yourself. But what we're going to do now that we've gotten through kind of the two scene setters, we'll move quickly around the group. If others want to weigh in or throw some examples in, feel free at about 30 seconds per person, but just go for it. Not all at once.
I'm happy to step in. Phil Dawson and Armilla AI. We are an AI system testing company that provides AI risk assessments and transfer solutions to enterprises backed by global reinsurers. So you'll hear me speak a little bit today about our experience testing different types of models and AI products and some of how we're thinking about ensuring AI risk. On the topic of use cases, we have a bit of a unique view because we do get to see quite a wide variety of customer AI products. Not all are consumer facing, but I'll share examples of some that I think are impacting consumers today. So interesting this year, we've had customers in the deepfake detection space. Interested in advertising how effective their models are at detecting generated content on seen versus unseen models, applications that are built on new releases. They haven't been trained to detect that type of AI generated content. Image generation for the branding, advertising, and cosmetics industry to promote high quality image generation that's diverse, inclusive, and fit for particular audiences. So there's a lot of attention being paid to the potential for either misogynistic or toxic image generation when these companies are putting the new AI generative AI based tools into their customers' hands. They want to make sure of the safety of these tools. Like VAR, we're seeing LLM based customer service applications across all sectors, really. Banking, insurance, telecommunications. Most companies deploying these at first internally with for employees' use, and then but with plans to deploy them publicly. So there's those are systems that are engaging or will be engaging shortly with consumers on a large scale. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Appreciate that. I see Angela moving towards the microphone.
We agreed I was going to jump in first. Okay. So, hi, folks. I'm Dave Wilner. I'm currently a fellow at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center studying the governance of new and emerging technologies. Historically, I have worked in industry doing trust and safety. That's the presence here. Couple of use cases that nobody's really touched on yet. One, and maybe this doesn't quite qualify as beneficial, but just really entertainment. There are a non-trivial number of these products that exist simply because people want to play with these systems as games or to generate images or those kinds of things. I would say that's actually a pretty substantial percentage of the actual use today. And another one is sort of building on the customer service idea, but information filtering and sort of response drafting. You're starting to see this stuff incorporated into things like email clients, other systems, maybe even arguably some of the chatbots as a way of people processing and responding to information more easily.
Hello, folks. I'm going to pull this a little bit closer to me. Good morning, folks. Angela McKay. I am with Google now. I have been in technology risk for about 25 years, with the first 15 or so in cybersecurity and the last 5 or so in trust and safety. I'll speak more when we get to the risk section because you can hear my background. But in thinking a little bit about use cases, I thought I'd maybe highlight one. There are so many that we are sending out from Google right now, but I think one of the ones that's really interesting that is consistent with what Dave said in entertainment is this idea of how do you enable creators? And so for a long time, you could think about how creators had to write their own scripts. They had to do a market analysis and build their business plan of where they would want to be creating content, how they would monetize that content. They would have to go out and find images to be able to use. Then they would create their video, and then your video would actually have to come through our process to see if it had any violations. And so you can think about each one of those steps in a creator's process being an opportunity to use AI. You have an idea? Hey, let me give it to the AI and see if it can build me a first draft of that script. Oh, wait, I need an image, and I don't necessarily want to go pay for one that's already like a license and pay for one. Oh, now I can go out and create my own. And then you can actually have the tools that we are providing that can pre-review those videos to make sure you don't get a strike if it goes up. And so that's just a couple of that real kind of user experience applied side of it. And then I'll say this, for every single person who is using Gmail, you've been using AI for a while. It's been suggesting different ways to write your email. It's been reminding you, quite usefully, I will say, when you haven't responded to something that's in your inbox for a little while. So just a couple of applications in that real consumer-facing space.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. My name is Ani Gavorkian. As Steve mentioned, I'm a director for public policy at Microsoft's Office of Responsible AI. I am also a lawyer by training, a privacy and communications regulatory lawyer. So I've been thinking about tech policy for the better part of the past 10 years. In terms of use cases, I thought I would build off of what Dave and Angela have been describing, just to talk a bit about some of the use cases that Microsoft offers for consumers. Again, you'll also hear me talk about this more a little later on. But the first one that comes to mind that some folks in this room might be familiar with is Copilot in Bing. And this was, our update of Bing to enable sort of chat-like responses when engaging with the search engine. Another integration of Copilot has been in Microsoft Word. And on the consumer side, we've seen this have like really helpful effects for people in their day-to-day lives. I'll give you just a personal example. Neither of my parents are native English speakers, and there have been many instances in their lives where they've had to, write communication and they've struggled and they've dragged their feet and they've been hesitant to do so. So for example, recently my dad had to write a letter to the homeowners association, and this is not a task I think anyone in this room especially cares to do. But you can use Copilot in Word to basically state the main points of what you want to say, and you don't have to worry about what the language is going to sound like. Is the grammar going to be correct? And so he was able to just like input the main points of what he wanted to get through to the homeowners association, and he had this letter generated that he felt really comfortable with and that he could then send. So there are cases like this that, we're really trying to sort of facilitate people's lives, facilitate their ability to communicate, their ability to work and learn. Those are just a few examples that are top of mind for me.
Fantastic. That probably a good laydown, and actually these last two use cases from Angela and Ani. Maybe that's hope, Philip, for the future as we write we're a nonprofit, so we write grant applications and they're very painful. We need a grant writing chatbot, and maybe that already exists. So we're going to look into that for sure. So I think we're going to pivot now into move two. So now that we've got a good kind of scene set of the types of applications and use cases that are out there, let's talk about risks. So drawing from these examples, what are the risks that need to be managed? So help me to understand and our audience to understand in real and tangible terms the types of harms or bad outcomes that need to be prevented. And so to lead us off, we have Belle to my left, and then we're going to then go to Angela. So Belle, do you want to lead us off here?
Hi, everyone. I'm Belle Torak. I'm another lawyer at the table, working at the intersection of free expression, civil rights, and online safety. I currently lead a burgeoning tech advocacy program at the Human Rights Campaign, but I spent years before that working for the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative on issues of non-consensual deepfakes and non-consensual pornography. So we've spoken about a lot of AI uses here: entertainment, lasagna, laundry, communication, something that is absolutely essential to the preservation of democracy. We've spoken about skin disease detection, deepfake detection, banking, the kind of decision-making that affects institutions and that affects people's lives significantly. I'm really excited that we're participating in this conversation because we're moving beyond this so-called move fast and break things mentality to make sure that the AI that we're furthering is mindful of risks to individuals' safety, privacy, access to information, institutional trust, and civil rights. Dangers that AI left unchecked can catalyze and exacerbate. One of the most, I'm trying to think of how to describe this in layman's terms. Algorithmic bias, a lot of the time, entrenches and exacerbates biases that have historically existed in society before AI. And it's something that we have to be really mindful of when we think about applications in the healthcare arena, where, for instance, Black women experience higher rates of mortality because of a lack of representation in the dermatological space. We see similar versions of this in banking, credit decisions, in the criminal justice system, which is a little bit afield since this is a mostly industry-focused conversation. But even when we think about things like Phil briefly mentioned deepfake detection, we have to be mindful of the litany of questions around efficacy, how long that data is retained. But more than that, we have to think about the broader issues here. A lack of transparency. A lot of the time when we're dealing with AI, we're dealing with k-means clustering. We're dealing with black box algorithms where not even the engineers of the algorithms can necessarily tell how we get the output based on a query, which erodes trust, especially when it's used for major decision-making. Dependency and automation bias, where an over-reliance on AI catalyzes this idea that, oh, because the AI gave it to us, this information to us, it is inherently right. So all this to say, we have a lot of things to be concerned about. And with that, I'll pass off to Angela.
Thanks, Phil. And unfortunately, I think I won't make it necessarily easier because I will say, you know, what I think is so interesting about AI is it really is bringing together disciplines and domains that have historically been separate, that have different focus and objectives, and also very different levels of maturity. And let me just give an example here. So on my way here this morning, I took an Uber so that I could do a little work in the car. And I asked 3 different AI chatbots, including the Google one, obviously, about the difference between cybersecurity and trust and safety and privacy. All 3 gave relatively good answers, but it's really clear in their answers. Basically, cybersecurity is about protecting digital assets and infrastructure. We can identify a vulnerability, draw a circle around it, cost it, and decide about acceptable and unacceptable risk. Privacy is about protecting data. It is more robust in terms of standards on a global scale because of GDPR. Basically, it set a floor and everybody goes up to meet that floor. But trust and safety is the newest discipline or domain in terms of moving forward as a discipline. It's been in existence for a long time, but it is relatively new. It is about protecting users and experiences. And this environment does not yet have the kinds of standards and practices and concepts of acceptable and unacceptable risk that exist in the other domains. And so I think that's one of the things we have to think about is this coming together of different disciplines and domains. And then second of all, as we think about what organizations are doing in the model and in the application space, we have to think about how we build safe, secure, trustworthy, and private experiences with transparency and accountability and consider societal harms. That last piece, consider societal harms, is where it all gets tricky. Because on a global scale, we don't all have the same societal values. And the environment that the technology industry is trying to create does work on that scale. So a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges as we think about addressing risk.
I'd like to jump in here, and then I'll also remind myself that if Eric, if you have any questions that are particularly on point, you're welcome to just kind of raise a hand and insert those. But let me open it up for interventions from others on the panel.
If I could just instigate a little bit for the panel, no original thought from my side, but to instigate a little bit. As you think about this piece of the discussion, I'd be curious to hear from you in terms of how organizations, private sector or otherwise, are thinking about how do you get uptake for what Angela was just talking about? When everything is moving so fast, how do you actually have conversations within organizations to think about societal harm? Right? You're thinking about user experiences, you're thinking about potentially individual harms. How does an organization, from your experiences, actually deal with that in real time right now? So not hypothetical, how is it actually happening as we're talking?
And also, is that conversation even happening?
So, as an investor, this is, I'm also a lawyer, but a recovering lawyer, now an investor. But as an investor in this space, what's really exciting about this domain is that all the challenges that Bell raised and the questions about societal harm and the like that Angela raised are all things that can be addressed, not solved necessarily, but addressed by technology and by capabilities. We can develop more capable models that are more explainable. We can develop capabilities that can identify challenges, identify bias, and counter it. We can create capabilities that can better secure the data you're putting in, the data that's coming out, and contest the data that's coming out against multiple other models, identify whether the models have a flaw or the data has a flaw or the output has a flaw. And so as an investor, this is a tremendous opportunity in trust, safety, and security. At the same time, when it comes to Angela's point about the societal harms, as investors, we've got to account for that, right? It is not simply sufficient for investors to stand by and say, it's fine, we're just investing purely for return. And in fact, we led a group of 9 investors, Paladin Capital did, at the White House to commit to standards and voluntary standards on trust, safety, and security, including investing in American and allied technologies and investing in capabilities that are consistent with the values of free and open societies. These are words you don't typically hear investors use or investors talk about. And that's because, as a general matter, investors think of our returns to LPs, but what we've identified is the fact that when you invest in trust, safety, and security, you have better uptake, as Bell pointed out, and you have better IP protection, as Angela and a few other folks have talked about. And so if you have those things, those make those companies more investable, more profitable, and more successful for your limited partners. And so as a result, we don't see any inconsistency between investing in national security capabilities, investing in trust, safety, and security, and making a return for our investors.
Fascinating. Eric has something for us.
To inject another subtopic, the questioner was asking about the Roundtable's thoughts on open source, open model weight AI, and specifically to the civil society folks, where do you hope governance of this issue goes?
So we're in, and I see Govind coming online. So we are in the risk section. So let's not get too far away, but let's take a hack at that, and then we'll move on to the next move.
Yeah, so I'm Govind Shivkumar. I work with Omidyar Network. We do both grant making and investments. Some of our portfolio is on the table. Stanford, Responsible Innovation Labs, IST, and also invested in Anthropic, Eleuther. So looking at both proprietary models and open models. And from a risk standpoint, of course, there is a continuum of risk, right? And there has been a lot of academic research which says the marginal risk of open models is reducing over a period of time. Dave might disagree with me.
Strongly.
Yeah. So I think the bigger issue is, I think, in many ways, people not understanding that there is a huge difference between what openness in a model is, and everybody's like shaping or like shipping openness in a model, and automatically our fundamental access question becomes like, hey, I can access this model and I can use it for a bunch of purposes versus I can see inside a model and I can exactly point out what the vulnerability is. The difference that we see from open source software from a risk standpoint is here you're dealing with open source software and data together inside a capable model, which can do many things, right? So we need like a new framework to think about this, and our responsible AI folks can help us think about a more responsible framework to move these models to responsible.
Dave, do you want to jump in real quick, and then we're going to move on to our next move.
Yeah, I'll take the bait. And sort of regrounding it in the initial question you asked, just to put a real fine point on some of the stuff we're seeing that's a little uncomfortable to talk about. We're in terms of real risks that are happening now, real abuses that are happening now with models. The by far most prevalent things we're seeing are the generation of artificial CSAM, child sexual abuse material, and artificial NCII, non-consensual intimate imagery of women and girls. The overwhelming majority of that activity is happening using open source models, not because any of the open source developers wanted that, but because from a technical point of view, we don't really have the capability to make models robustly and capable of doing things if you have access to the weights and source code, if they're really far down that openness spectrum. And as someone who more generally does think open source is good as a broader movement, I worry about it as something where and this is maybe when I'm shading a little into what should we do next, but we need better solutions there to make those models more robust against misuse, because currently they're not. And it is, I would say, hands down, the most real ongoing harm.
So perfect segue. Moving on to our third move, mitigation approaches. So we've laid some wonderful groundwork on consumer-focused AI use cases and the risks that can accompany them. So what are some of the ways to mitigate these risks? So we're going to lead off with Ani, and then Jamil's going to share as well, and then we'll have a robust conversation. So if you have questions that are along these lines, feel free to submit those into the whatever system we're using for that, and Eric will screen those questions.
Thanks, Steve. So to answer this question, there are like a variety of different angles that you could take, but I think given the way the conversation is going, it might be helpful to sort of zoom out a bit and talk about risk management as the holistic process that it needs to be. So the way that we think about this at Microsoft is probably very familiar to many of the folks in this room who are familiar with the NIST risk management framework, to other large companies and institutions who are also familiar with this model. But the idea is that there are sort of phases of thinking about risk management. The first is that you sort of have to have a governance process in place, which means that you have to have things like policies and procedures and processes that detail how you as an organization think about responsible AI and the risks that you want to address. The next is that you have to map risks. And by mapping risks, we really need identifying risks. And here we get to Phil's question. How do you identify risks? One concrete tool that we use and that many other organizations use is something called an impact assessment. It's maybe very basic for some folks in the room, but the idea is that when you're building a system, you're thinking at the front end, what are the potential harms? What are the foreseeable harms or risks that this system can produce? You map those out. And you think about specifically on the front end, how do you build in technical mitigations for those? But the first step is mapping out the risks. Risks can also be mapped or identified by conducting red teaming or stress testing, where basically you intentionally try to see whether the system can create harmful or risky outputs so that you can address those concerns on the front end before the system is released. So that's the mapping piece. The next piece is measuring. The whole point of mapping risks is to be able to measure them and see whether you're actually being effective in resolving them. And there are a variety of ways that measurement takes place, but the idea is you want to develop metrics and see whether you're meeting those metrics in reducing your risk exposure. Finally, there is the manage piece, the mitigate piece. And here, especially when it comes to generative AI, Here is where you're really talking about like implementing technical mitigation measures. And this can happen both at the model layer and it can happen at the application layer. And this is where we get to some things that Dave was talking about, like how do you build in classifiers to detect CSAM? How do you build in, prompt enhancers to, turn prompts away from potentially harmful outputs? And how do you build in tools like content provenance labels that can help users understand whether a piece of content was AI generated or not? So this is sort of at a high level how we are thinking about risk management.
Okay, so we're going to turn over to Jamil for his contribution.
There we go. Yeah. So, I think the framework that Ani laid out is really helpful because it helps us think about, the steps you go through as a company to understand, identify the risk, and then ultimately take steps to mitigate it. I think if we step even further back, as Ani zoomed out to whatever, 30,000, 40,000 feet, let me zoom out to 80,000 feet and think about who's responsible for figuring out what responsible AI is, and what it means to mitigate, identify, mitigate, and take steps against trust and safety risks. And I would say there's sort of three actors in this domain, right? There's obviously the government, when we can talk about regulation and what that might look like. And there's a lot of talk on Capitol Hill and the administration about regulation. And we've seen this 110-page AI executive order. But there's other players. It's not just the government that has a role in figuring out what the risks are from AI and taking steps to mitigate those risks. Ani talked about companies and how they identify those risks. That's obviously another player. But then there's also consumers. There's all of us, right? In our role as acquirers and users of this technology. And truth be told, until we hold companies and the government accountable for what's taking place in the AI domain, nothing's going to change. We don't hold companies responsible for cybersecurity challenges. We don't hold companies accountable for CSAM on their platforms. We don't hold companies accountable for other kinds of problematic content, whether it's misinformation or disinformation from adversaries. And we expect the companies to solve it and fix it for us. And we expect the government to come in and step in and fix it for us. But we don't care enough to vote with our feet as consumers. No matter how much garbage there is on name your social platform you like, you stay on it. In fact, more often than not, the more bad content the companies have found, the more you like it, the more you follow it. So if you're looking for who's responsible for the challenges in AI and the challenges in content in the internet, it's you and me. It's not the companies. It's not the government. And so, yes, we can ask the government to intervene and set standards for us. We can ask companies to do their part and figure out what the risks are and take steps to mitigate those risks. But until we as consumers decide we're not going to accept companies who offer this kind of content, right? And AI that has its challenges and is problematic, right? Things are not fundamentally going to change. And then, of course, I cannot, of course, forget the fourth part in this group of people that are responsible, the investors. And from an investor perspective, I mentioned it earlier, from an investor perspective, we do expect there are investors like us, and there's a lot of us who hold our companies accountable for how they operate, who they sell to, and the like, but there aren't enough. And again, ultimately, what will drive that question is less the money flows, less from the investors, less the companies who do it, and less the government who regulates it, because the government can't keep up with the technology to save their lives. Every regulation will be outdated the minute it's on the books, and might actually lead to worse outcomes because it's so outdated so quickly. It's going to be us. We have to hold people accountable for what's online and what's available. And until we do, nothing's going to change.
Well, thank you for being provocative. But something comes to my mind, and I think Belle might have something to weigh in on this one as well. Around privacy and how the average user thinks about the information that they are providing to the big tech companies, clicking through terms of use agreements. There's just how could the average consumer possibly even understand the implications, or to feel like that they have agency, that they're empowered to be able to push back on these complex topics. And so I don't know what the answer is. I'm not necessarily asking you directly, Jamil. So let me just kind of open it up to the rest of the group as to whether anything about what Jamil had to offer resonates with you. Belle, let's turn to you.
I have a couple of things to say here. Yes, consumers are immensely powerful. We have the ability to invest our hard-earned money toward products and services that we deem worthwhile. However, it's antithetical to many aspects of the legal process to put the onus on consumers to protect themselves. We have so many legal frameworks that are designed to ensure that consumers, when they purchase a product, have a reasonable expectation of its safety and viability. Jamil also briefly brought something up, the idea of platforms not being liable for the harmful content on their platforms. This is because of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was designed to promote robust discourse online, but that in recent years has led to some outsized harms. But the final important point that I want to make here is the mis and disinfo point that hasn't really come up yet. Mis and disinfo, we're seeing it proliferate, we're seeing it amplified by social media platforms. Yes, because consumers tend to upvote and engage more with incendiary content as opposed to its more truthful, often less sexy counterpart. However, it shouldn't be incumbent necessarily on consumers to go through the intense media literacy process of determining what is and isn't real, especially in a moment where determining veracity is increasingly difficult.
I think we have time for one more. Dave?
It's bouncing off those ideas, but sort of going in a slightly different direction, which is, and grounding back in the original question on mitigations, I think that there's a lot of room for using these tools to help us become better at the historical tasks of trust and safety. And the reason I believe that, maybe to a degree that is somewhat stronger than is normal, is because I think there's often a misunderstanding of why current systems fail. There are a lot of reasons, but one of the core reasons is actually that the task is hard and we're honestly not that good at it. And the reason we're not that good at it is it depends on human labor at root, and that human labor is not terribly reliable. We're not in a situation where like the largest players are secretly amazing at content moderation and refusing to do a good job because Mark Zuckerberg loves talking to the Senate. Like that's not the configuration we're in. The configuration we're in is like, yes, you can talk about incentives and product design, but also just the core task is hard to do well. And the capacity of generative AI to be analytical and to do analytical labor stands to make us potentially much better at that very, very soon. It's something I spend a bunch of time working on personally.
Go ahead.
Just a two, like a one finger. I mean, the fact that, despite an airplane door falling out of the sky, Jamil took an airplane this morning, proves that government can regulate and figure out a way to control tech, right? So the airline industry is an excellent example of extremely complex laws, markets, investors, technologists coming together to solve the problem. So I think the question is like, how do you really make the system work and not make it just efficient, but how do you make the system be more inclusive and more robust, right? And it will take some time. This technology is like 18 months old. We still have a long way to go.
I'd just like to add one point. Hi, I'm Lauren Wagner. I'm with Responsible Innovation Labs, developed the first AI governance framework for startups and investors. So I'm really representing the startup ecosystem here. And I think there is a real technical gap when you say consumers should be advocating for themselves. But I know for me personally and others I know, there is a lack of understanding of how does this technology actually work. And so I do believe that there's an opportunity to bring together folks who are technically sophisticated, early stage founders, people within open source communities who maybe are not at the big companies and part of these concentrated systems of power, and leverage their expertise to bring them into the conversations, bring them into policy conversations, and get a wider diversity of perspectives in a way that's still adding to the kind of technical sophistication of the conversation, but really having those viewpoints shared. And I think there's some organizing that needs to be done, and that's what I'm working on, but I don't want to discount the participation of developers and engineers.
Thanks, Lauren. Great point. Angela has a two finger, and then we're going to move on to move three, wherever we are. We're going to figure it out.
Just really quickly, I want to build on Dave's point of it's hard and tie back to what I said at the beginning. You know, if you think about trust and safety risk, again, these are trade-offs in norms and values, right? And so I'm going to give you a real example. When Russia went into Ukraine, there was a whole lot of conversation about YouTube and when and how we think about YouTube in Russia. And that's a trade-off between access to information and access to misinformation. Okay, so just putting that stark, bright kind of thing in front of you, I want to highlight that those are very difficult. I think AI has a lot to do to help us here, and I will preview that the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, which is a group of platform companies, is coming forward with a report in the near future that talks about how we as companies are leveraging AI to help counter abuse.
I mean, can you talk about what YouTube did during after the vote and after the Russian invasion? There's a good story to tell there.
That's you.
Oh, that's me. So ultimately, you know, the decision was that access to information and possibly having access to truthful information was very, very important. And so YouTube stayed up.
But you demonetized problematic content.
And yes, consistent with our policies as well as the sanction orders, we did the best we could to both demonetize problematic content using all of our existing policies as well as the sanction orders. But again, it's that very difficult trade-off. We're mitigating that misinformation harm in region, but it's still that trade-off.
Okay, so we can stay on time. We're going to close this part out and we're going to move on to standardization and evaluations. So I'd imagine that certain AI risks are widely applicable and certain mitigation approaches are or will become widely accepted as best practice. If so, how do we routinize them and evaluate them that they are correctly and consistently being implemented? So on this piece, we're going to lead off with Phil from Armilla AI and also Lauren to get us started on this part of the conversation. Phil?
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. And I think that I think Ani did a great job, frankly, of introducing this topic and discussing the mitigations and laying out some of the core components of the NIST AI risk management framework. I won't repeat them, but I will say that I think from a standardization perspective, we are for AI and trust and safety, we are still very much at the level of determining what the process standards are for organizations. Ani mentioned policies, procedures. You could even go down to the system level. VAR's organization, Responsible AI Institute, has a system level assessment, but these are qualitative assessments about the processes that go into developing AI systems and what tests, or have, asking questions about whether tests have been conducted, what types of data sets, data sheets, model cards. But in terms of performance-based or outcomes-based standards or thresholds for different metrics or measurements that we care about, this is just very difficult because what is, Angela spoke about this, but what is safety in one context, or certain values that are important in one country or another? It's just very, there's a lot of variety based on the context, based on the application, based on the system. It's very, very difficult to set those types of standards for what types of outcomes we want to achieve. I think with generative AI, and it's, to Govind's point, it's 18 months, right? This is very, very nascent. People are starting to think about some of the deal breaker scenarios that we can't have, right? So the kind of the floor of what is unacceptable around privacy, leakage and inputs or outputs, or other sensitive data, toxic content. And then we get kind of more into the muddier zones of what is toxic, what is free speech. And we're kind of back into the content moderation discussion all over again, right? So it's standardization is very it's hard to know how it will emerge for that category of problems that we have around outcomes and the user experience. But I'll maybe make one comment and then pass it along to Lauren. But Govind raised the aviation example, and Jamil flying to the meeting today. Yeah, that's an industry that has done a really great job of improving safety over time. I used to work at the UN Aviation Safety Organization, setting standards for drones. A little bit more complex as an emerging technology, and a lot of stakeholders, a lot of different capabilities that were also nascent. Still much simpler than AI and the user experience in a variety of contexts, right? And there are some interesting lessons there where different stakeholders, regulators, standards bodies, startups, the industry incumbents develop simulations of different operations over years, 26 different simulations they fly annually and monitor and collect data to inform standardization processes. And understand what a mature capability was. That's something that I think could be interesting for AI. I think the feasibility at a public scale is difficult, but it makes me think of some of the crowdsourced red teaming that we've seen. If there was more structure and a systemic approach to identifying priority issues and risks, that's the type of project that I think could move the needle until the next models are released.
And Lauren, Rio.
Yeah, I'll introduce myself. So I've spent over 10 years building products in areas that deal with privacy sensitive data. So I've worked at Google and Meta building products to combat misinformation. I'm a social scientist by training. For the past year or so, I've been working with Responsible Innovation Labs. So we're a consortium of 100+ startups and venture funds, a lot that you've heard of, some of the biggest funds in the world that are committed to supporting startups that have a responsible innovation mindset, meaning that they think about the societal consequences of the products they're building, and we develop resources and tools to help them kind of operationalize the values that they think of, as a company as they progress and move along. So in terms of standardization and evaluation, we're in a really interesting time when it comes to AI governance. You have a lot of recommendations coming out of industry and working groups and, private companies, startups, policymakers, et cetera. So we do have some kind of North Star standards that are emerging. There's the ISO standard that has come out on artificial intelligence. So that's being conceived as something like a SOC 2, like a cybersecurity standard. So something that you as a company would apply for and be accredited in. But I think I wanted to share a few anecdotes from some of the communities that I'm a part of and some of the startup founders that I work with, because how does something transition from just a recommendation to an industry standard? And so that's kind of the chasm I'm helping to cross for places like Responsible Innovation Labs and other organizations. So we've spoken about the NIST AI risk management framework. And so for me, in developing the first AI governance framework for startups and investors, which we actually worked with the Department of Commerce on this was endorsed. We now have dozens of companies that have adopted it. We really oriented around the NIST AI RMF and translated that to something that made sense to early stage founders that really just want to stay in business. They're not thinking about responsible innovation or AI governance. They're thinking about the next year or 2 years. But what happened was when they went to go acquire customers and they would go and speak to companies, especially in regulated industries, so think defense tech, insurance, financial services, these executives are saying, okay, we're happy to work with you, but we want to make sure that you're going to adhere to the NIST AI risk management framework. And a lot of these founders, they're 10-person companies are saying, oh, we actually have no idea what that is. And so it's an interesting opportunity for an organization like Responsible Innovation Labs to say, okay, these companies want to acquire customers.
they don't really understand what these executives are talking about. And so we're going to develop the tools so that they can prove their trustworthiness to large enterprises. And that comes back to how do we show customers that we're trustworthy. So you can kind of see all of these different disparate groups now have aligned incentives to actually start adopting some of these recommendations. And that's how they really become industry standards. So that's one example from the startup founder perspective. I also work with the Data and Trust Alliance, which is similar to what Angela was saying, a kind of an industry consortium. On the other side of it, enterprises are saying, we want to work with these small startups. We actually don't know what our evaluation criteria should be. We work across disparate industries. And so you have these industry consortiums coming together, and executives are working really collaboratively, even though they might be in competition in actuality, and say, okay, what if we want to work with AI companies, what do we as industry and Fortune 500 companies, what should we be saying to these companies? What kind of mark should we be putting down, and goals that, wanting them to achieve so that we can actually contract with them. So those are two from the startup and the industry perspective. I'll give one more example, an organization that I really love called ML Commons. So we're an open source engineering consortium. I know some of us are members here. And so ML Commons has been incredible. They have multiple working groups. Everyone has a lot of industry expertise, and we're able to work very collaboratively. And so what ML Commons has been able to do, leveraging this open source model, is they've been able to come together, build these really incredible working groups, as I said, and develop recommendations that then become industry standards. So they did this with something called ML Perf, which is the standard for how you train models. And now they have an AI safety benchmark. So we've been working on this for many months. Groups represent civil society, academic research, industry, et cetera. And so just to give you a flavor, so we have a benchmark that runs a series of tests for a taxonomy of hazards. So we spent many months working together. What would a taxonomy of hazards look like? And we spoke about, is this taxonomy of harms? Is this taxonomy of risks? And so all of these things are being actively talked about and worked through together. And we have experts in the group that are helping us do this. So just give you a flavor of what's happening. And I do want to say that it's also a very exciting time, because if you are interested in joining these conversations, there are a lot of groups that are open to having others come in and participate. And that's at the working group level, the industry level, and also the regulatory level. We have laws being proposed like SB 1047 in California that's now being discussed in the state Senate. And so legislators are wanting to hear from people within these communities to understand how we can do AI governance, evaluation, and developing how we can do that better. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity.
Thank you, Lauren. Fantastic. Anybody want to jump in on this? Var?
Yeah, thank you. So, people have mentioned ISO and NIST, and obviously the Responsible AI Institute works on a certification program at the system level. I also want to kind of call out the G7 Code of Conduct, which I think is a really important kind of multilateral effort to internationalize some of the approaches that we've seen the White House take when dealing with faster developing kind of generative AI systems. I also kind of have three, just having dealt with these issues at a number of organizations over the past few years, have three observations. So first is, to Philip's question of how do we make these kind of soft law instruments and mitigations kind of stick? I think we've talked about a lot of different ways. We talked about laws, we talked about kind of consumers, companies, investments. I would kind of add to that government procurement as a big lever, because, given the federal government's purchasing power, if they kind of wrap the NIST AI RMF and kind of ask agencies to kind of layer in their requirements and map them to the NIST AI RMF, short of like hard law, that's a pretty effective way of creating behavioral change. Second is a challenge that we see at the Institute is that mature governance policies, tools, and training tend to be easier at big companies. And so it's really important to kind of foster and to handhold smaller companies and individuals in this journey. And then finally, the intervention points need to vary by stage, and we need to kind of get into the psychology of when should we give which message to whom to make it effective. Because somebody just kind of dabbling in talking to ChatGPT, if it's on a company platform, they might just need a reminder not to enter company information, something as simple as that. If you're actually designing an AI system, you need to think about the data and design choices, but you don't need to do a full kind of assessment. Whereas later, if you're about to go live and you're about to kind of go into production with a large number of users, you probably do want an independent, not just an assessment, but an independent view of that assessment. So there's a lot of work to be done about what's most effective when.
Thanks, Var. Angela, I think you had something to offer, and then we're going to move into governance.
Just a quick comment, because we're talking about some big frameworks and the development of standards. And I thought I might bring it down just a little bit to, Phil, you had teed up earlier, kind of how do organizations think about balancing and hitting the right balance point in societal harms? And this is an area where I think there is a lot of opportunity for more development. I know that, for example, in the development of policies for community policies for Google products and services, we work with civil society on a global basis and bring people in to help formulate where those lines are. And I think that there's a real opportunity to also extend that model into AI. And that's one of the things we're also doing is how do you start engaging with the public and civil society pre-launch to really think about where the lines should be. Again, recognizing that that will not be perfect, because wherever the line lands, there's going to be something that is outside of the line. That's risk management, right? And so just recognizing that regardless of where you draw that line, including building on societal input, there's still going to be cases that fall outside that you find unacceptable, but that really are somewhat in that space of okay.
So I understand from Eric that we have a question that's apropos. So Eric, will you ask it?
Yeah, and this falls into this category in the next one, but the question was the executive order from last October. The questioner asked, does it have any teeth in addressing some of the concerns discussed?
Ani, has an answer?
I have a theory of an answer. And actually, it picks up off of what Var was talking about regarding how powerful a tool federal procurement can be in setting standards and building best practices. So to answer the question, one of the things that the executive order did was task the OMB with developing guidelines for federal agencies in their procurement of AI systems, including generative AI systems. And there are sort of special considerations in the guidelines that OMB put out, which were only at the end of March, around rights and safety impacting systems. So special attention was given to those. And then even on top of that, rights impacting systems are subject now to an even more robust set of requirements. So the OMB, so the executive order has teeth in that it required OMB to put out these requirements that federal agencies must then abide by. And then those requirements pass down to vendors, to suppliers, to AI companies who want to offer their systems and services to federal governments and federal agencies. And we've seen this system happen before. Oftentimes federal procurement is sort of the first push in developing a set of best practices and standardizing practices. So in that regard, yes, the executive order sort of indirectly does have teeth in that regard. But just to sort of also play off some of the points that Phil and Angela were making, Govind, we are still at the relatively early stages of this process. And even the guidelines that LMB put out, the requirements they put out, we were just having a chat before the panel started, are relatively high level. And so there's necessarily going to be, in the first instance, a variety of interpretations. But that's kind of part of the process. We saw this process play out in the cybersecurity context, Angela, as you may remember, with the development of FedRAMP. Before you can get to more detailed, concrete guidelines against which there can be sort of more strict measurement and auditing, you kind of have to go through these growing pains of, putting out initially a set of flexible guidelines, seeing what the response is, and then having this, cooperative feedback loop between vendors, companies, and federal agencies sort of work through, what they're receiving, where there needs to be more, where more can be done. Then you reach a next iteration of what vendors are able to offer to show compliance to address some of these risks. And you kind of go from there. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, we're at this, I think, really important point in the process where we are getting firm guidelines that, have to be complied with, that have the potential to create best practices that everyone in the ecosystem can benefit from. But we're early in that process, and there's very much more to come.
Okay, fantastic. So that's a perfect pivot point. So we're going to move on to our last theme topic as we turn to governance. And I'll scope this very broadly. So where are we and where are we headed in terms of governing AI risk in the consumer product space? And for our group here, feel free to touch on what's happening in individual companies, industry alliances, the investment community, consumer protection regulators, and even international bodies. And to lead us off are Dave and Govind, and then we will have a short conversation. I guess Govind's going to lead, and then we'll see where it goes.
Thank you. I think a bit more intro. Omidyar Network, founded by Pierre Omidyar, also founder of eBay. And I'm not a lawyer. Thank you. I have a more unique degree. It's called an MBA. So I'm going to sort of push us into thinking about governance in a slightly different way. Right? We spoke about standards. I think the problem is we spoke about 5 standards today. So who's a good impresario to sort of push and enforce these standards, right? Because often they end up being voluntary. How do you mitigate these risks? And if you have solutions, what pushes the ecosystem? One of the things that we've been thinking about, at least I've been thinking about for a while, is to think about infrastructure, institutions, and incentives. And a lot of times you only focus on infrastructure, which is tools, and institutions. What new institutions do we need? What laws do we need? What regulation do we need? But we forget, like, in a democracy and in capitalism, money goes the wrong way, right? So sort of in terms of incentives for governance, I'm going to give you 3 examples to think about as a framework. One is perhaps think of an OTF kind of a fund, an open technology fund, which funded Signal. The problem was communication was not encrypted. OTF funded Signal. Many challenges in sustainability, but it's a great tool. TOR is another example. And OTF is a relatively small, funded by the Department of Media, only $45 million a year, and funds amazing stuff. So think of an AI trust and safety fund set up by the government. Second example is of an impresario. We spoke about government, but think about a program like NSF and NAIR. They are basically saying, hey, we will think about public investment in compute and data sets and technical capabilities. If this is going to be a $2.6 billion program over the next 6 years, it's incentives, but you can actually include stuff like, hey, here are the safety mechanisms if you're going to access our resources. You're going to access free compute, if you're going to access free data sets, you're going to take our technical capabilities, then here are the safety mechanisms you need to build into these products before you release them, right? A third example, and then I'll stop and hand it over to Dave, is thinking about institutional investors. We often forget that government is not the only large procurer, but institutional investors in this country put $16 trillion into the economy. And institutional investors then incentivize venture capital firms, they incentivize public companies. And historically, it has taken us a while, but we still have somewhat robust financial standards, right? Companies are supposed to disclose financial standards, and people go to prison if they lie on financial statements. So the question is, how do you then push these institutional investors to ask the right questions on AI safety that pushes through? Because then you don't get money. And if you don't get money, you sort of disappear from the ecosystem.
Building on those points and on some of the points folks made earlier, I think there's a couple of sort of interesting currents going on that will marry well with all of that. So one is we've seen experimentation from a number of the sort of foundation AI companies, Anthropic and OpenAI, that I know of, although there are definitely others, in participatory rule setting to try to get at some of what we talked about earlier around sort of how do we create norms that not only exist but are legitimate, because the people who are outside of any set of rules don't want to be on the outside. That's why they were doing the things that broke the rules. There's been some really interesting experimentation on using AI-powered systems to actually allow people to engage in sort of structured discourse, less voting and more dialogue processes, to actually try to come up with standards that they can all live by. Specifically in the case of Anthropic's efforts, they actually had a participatory crafting of the constitutional principles, which is what they call them, that are their sort of axioms they build into their alignment of their core model. So that process wasn't just, oh, we talked to everybody and heard their feelings and that was nice. It actually got directly technically baked into what the model will and will not do, which is a really cool example of that sort of participatory governance in a much more direct sense. And I think more experiments along those lines would be really, really interesting. And then the second is there's sort of bubbling energy in the ether around more investments from either civil society or other places in open source tooling to do trust and safety better. Historically, because the industry is relatively young, everyone basically has rolled their own stack. People have put together their own tooling for managing their systems as they grew, because there was nothing to buy and nothing to download from GitHub, because maybe it didn't even exist when you started your social network. And I think moving to a place where that's no longer true, and instead there is a set of tools to grab to do the best practices with, that at least cover the basics, will go a pretty long way, particularly sort of further down the slope of size of company.
Fascinating. Did I see a finger over here? Any interventions? Oh, sorry. Hold on.
Yeah, I'll maybe add another incentive for good governance on the table. I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that our company is working on creating new insurance products for AI. Insurance is going to be eligibility for insurance products for AI is going to be an incredible incentive for good governance. Part of our process for determining that eligibility is assessing enterprises against the very frameworks we've been discussing today. How mature are your risk management processes? Have you tested the models? What types of performance and vulnerabilities do we see? And all feeding into an underwriting model to price coverage for AI risk. So there's going to be incredible market-based incentive for companies, not perfect, it's not going to cover everything. But if you want to reduce your premiums and be covered for certain liabilities, you have a strong incentive to adopt leading frameworks such as NIST, to apply the latest benchmarks, and to keep up to speed, not only with regulations and standards, but best practices and whatever soft law has emerged, whether it's code of conduct. I think we should actually pay more attention to the softer types of soft law as we look at AI, but they're really going to be extremely useful for businesses going forward in lowering their risk profile and also being eligible for insurance.
So let me ask, out of ignorance, is this a thing? Are there insurance products specifically for AI risk? I see Lauren nodding her head.
Well, today there's silent coverage and existing policies, tech E&O errors and omissions policies. There's business interruptions that may cover aspects. The insurance community is looking at carving much of this out and creating bespoke products There are some products in the market already that cover certain liabilities, and there most definitely will be more.
Yeah, I'll just say from a venture investor perspective, we saw this with cyber insurance. So insurance to cover cybersecurity risks, and we're seeing the same with AI.
I'd add, we also saw, it's a somewhat different domain, but we saw evolution of insurance around the sharing economy, very significant evolution in both the home sharing and rides space.
This is fascinating stuff. We are going to have to turn to our last prompt. So as we conclude, I'll share that our original title for this session began, "Who's Got This?" And we shortened it to make sure it fit on the website well. But I think that question still needs to be answered. So I'd like to ask each of our participants to share the number one thing they think that we as a community should do next. So maybe what I'll do is I'll go in the alphabetical order from our original list here. Sorry, folks, we're going to feel called out, but Phil, I'm going to start with you.
So what should we do next? There are some things, some recent activities that are kind of being launched that I'm quite excited about. So I do think there's a great opportunity with the AI Safety Institutes and the consortium that has been set up to look at things that we discussed today in hopefully a more production and user-centric perspective, but around evaluations and metrics and assessment frameworks. We haven't got to that level of granularity yet with more centralized efforts for involving stakeholders from across the spectrum at such a scale. So I think that could be it's very promising, and I think that's a great place to start.
Thank you, Phil. And next to Rehan.
I think from a product perspective, we already have a lot of sort of safe consensus industry safety standards established. We sort of continue to refine those voluntary standards. So we feel that in this area, similar application, similar to what Phil said, similar application can be applied. So I think going forward is to work to standardize, harmonize internationally, collaborate and create those consensus standards. And most of our effort is focused on coordinating and developing those standards through NIST, and then emphasize the need of having that sort of public and private partnership with possibly someone like NIST as a mediator for that process.
Thanks, Rehan. Okay, over to Ani.
Actually had a very similar response to Rehan's, which is to focus on identifying and sharing best practices, both within industry, across industry and consumer groups, and then across industry and government. As Phil was saying, there's still a lot of hard work to be done to figure out some of the thornier issues in this space. And it behooves all of us, especially when we're thinking about, in particular, safety issues, to be sharing that information. That's why institutions like the Frontier Model Forum were developed, because there's this recognition, and there's membership is going to be expanding in that. There's a recognition that when it comes to things like AI safety, that there's no gatekeeping here. And so in the safety context, but also more broadly, focusing on identifying and sharing best practices and using those best practices to inform regulations as they unfold, I think is where we as an ecosystem need to be focusing.
Thanks, Ani. Over to you, Jamil.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Steve. Sorry. Thanks, Phil, for having us. Thanks, Steve, for hosting this event. I think a lot of what this turns on is a question of who's gonna take responsibility here. That was the question you asked, right? And I think at the end of the day, it's got to be each one of us, our companies, our individuals, our investors, our government. But what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is we're in a battle for what it means to have trust, safety, and security in this ecosystem. It is not a battle between random parties. It's not a battle of economics. It is a battle of values, fundamentally. And there are our values, Western values, the values of the United States, our allies, and there are other countries that have different values. And if we don't act to implement our values in these technologies, today we lead the technology domain. We will always have that lead necessarily. But But if we want to maintain that lead, we've got to embed trust, safety, and security in our capabilities, and we've got to build them around our values. And that means everyone in this ecosystem has responsibility to play in that space. And so when it comes to investors, we have to invest in capabilities that benefit us and our allies. We have to invest with our values and the values of free and open societies in mind, and companies that benefit from operating in this environment, right? Remember, as investors, we get the benefit of allocating capital freely because we operate in a free society. Companies are able to grow and innovate because they operate in a free society. People don't want to build their businesses in China and Russia. They want to build them here in the United States. Sometimes in Europe, but not so much. Mostly in the United States. And why is that? It's because of our economic and political system. And if we don't defend that economic and political system in the way we invest, in the way our companies build, in the way our government regulates or doesn't regulate, we're not going to succeed. And so we can talk about trust and safety and security and best practices all we want, but until our companies that are based here in the United States and based in Europe and based in the West, and our investors who are based in the United States and based in Europe, based in the West, actually take action, it's not going to work.
And a nod to Phil, I think they want to also invest in building in Canada too, right?
We love Canada. Neighborhood, 51st state.
Excellent. Okay, so Angela. Over to you.
Okay, just maybe a bit of a plea. I feel like we've had a fairly mature conversation in this particular room, recognizing that there are existing domains to leverage insights from as we move forward with this new technology. Whether it is the insurance market, whether it is the continual learning of standards, whether it is the idea that there is some safety and security that is a public good and not something that is competitive. I think it is really important that we pull forward domain knowledge from other spaces. It may not apply perfectly, but pull it forward, see what applies and doesn't, and evolve and innovate. But what I worry about is because the technology is moving really fast, sometimes we're not having that weight. There are reference points to integrate as we mature. So stop relearning.
Excellent. Philip Reiner.
The timing is perfect because I've been sitting here actually thinking of the exact opposite of what you just said, which is, I think when it comes to what we're talking about here in terms of these absolutely foundational movements with AI, is some of this won't be changeable later. And I think we've experienced this in cybersecurity in a very, very painful way, right? We've been playing so much cleanup because what was originally built was so fundamentally flawed, right? We don't have the time with AI to iterate incessantly for the next 10 years to try to get to FedRAMP. We have to do this now. And so we have lessons that we can take from the past from other domains, but we also have to remember that they aren't actually all that useful because this is totally different in a lot of ways. And so I think we need to be very frank with ourselves when thinking about frameworks for evaluation, approaches for investment, et cetera. You're going to learn a little bit from the past, but at the end of the day, we have to come up with brand new ways of thinking about this problem set, and we need to move way faster. I think I often talk about this. It's kind of like the railroads. The railroads, by way of example, in the United States, were laid in a way such that they've not been changed since. You're doing that with AI right now. You're not going to change it. So what you're putting down right now is not going to be alterable later. We've got to get it right, or else we're going to end up with the same problems that we have with the internet, same problems we have with cybersecurity. 10, 15, 20 years from now, everybody's going to be suffering as a result. We got to move better. We got to move faster. Yeah.
Thanks, Philip. Var.
Thank you. Yeah, so the question is, what should we do next? So I think it would be good to take some sort of stock taking at a global level, not kind of constrained by industry or constrained by what our kind of incentives are. Is our approach to AI risk working kind of at the 100,000 foot view? So my organization kind of focuses on individual companies and individual use cases. We don't think a lot about how those use cases will interact with each other. And that's, even if you build two systems that are doing well in terms of assessments, they might interact with each other in weird ways. And we need, so I would like to know that there's somebody in the ecosystem that's thinking about that. The other thing that we assume is that people are using them in good faith. And, that's not always the case. There might be people using it for bad purposes. There might be governments or regimes using them for bad purposes. So just kind of what I propose for the community is thinking through whether we're at a very high level working on the right problems given the potential risks. Oh, and I know that Stanford HAI and Schmidt Futures are have started doing a little bit of work on this.
Thanks for Govind.
Yes, hopefully the railroad experience is slightly better than Amtrak, but yeah. Our AI experience. I have two quick next steps. One is, I think, petition to fund the NIST AI Safety Institute. Second is set up a trust and safety innovation unit, just like we have a defense innovation, funded with $100 million with federal funding, and ask the private sector to fund $100 million.
Yeah, I like it. Beth.
Sustainability, sustainability, sustainability. I think that as trust and safety professionals are at the helm of these efforts, and as companies are increasingly gutting these efforts, we need to figure out some kind of sustainable business mechanism by which we can keep trust and safety alive. At the risk of sounding postmodern, I think that we need to have like a radical thinking of what trust and safety looks like. Maybe instead of it being vertical within companies, finding a way to make trust and safety more communicative and horizontal, such that there is like an interoperable set of skills that people can take from one organization to another as we seek to streamline these processes.
Thanks, Bill. Lauren?
So when I worked at Meta on trust and safety, I was really struck by the fact that there were individuals who were making content policy decisions for billions of people that were incredibly impactful. And there was not much transparency into how these decisions were made and why. And so when I think about the future of AI and working with founders, I'm really focused on making sure that their interests are represented in policy conversations. You can envision, founders weighing in on like surveys and things at scale where you can kind of distill down what their considerations are and translate that back to policymakers. Because my concern is that power is so concentrated in some of these large companies, and they're going to be making decisions and creating precedent that does impact people around the world. And so we need a counterweight to that. And I think part of that is developing a vibrant innovation ecosystem and ensuring that folks with technical sophistication are involved in these wider conversations.
Thanks, Lauren. And Dave.
We did it. Great. So a couple of things. One, building on what Govind had said, I think sort of funding development specifically around AI, using the emerging AI capabilities to do safety better is a thing that everyone should be focusing on as much as they possibly can. It is the only way we will end up with tooling that is fast enough to deal with the pace of change that these systems are unleashing. And then just a quick sort of plug on the point about interoperable skills. My wife happens to also work in this field and runs an organization called the Trust and Safety Professionals Association, which is exactly trying to create a professional body that is horizontal across companies and allows people to actually take their knowledge with them.
Thanks, Dave. What a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate participation of our panelists. You've given us a lot to think about, and at the Institute for Security Technology, we are working on some of these problems, and we have an ambition with our Applied Trust and Safety Initiative to be helping advance some of these concepts as well in collaboration with many of the other civil society organizations that have been referenced. So we're going to be taking the inputs that we heard here, the questions from the audience, even if they didn't get asked out loud and answered. we have those recorded and we're going to be taking and thinking about those. We're going to be thinking about the conversation here and doing some writing on that and helping, and it's going to help us to plan the work going forward. I'd like to offer my boss, Philip Reiner, an opportunity if there's anything you would want to offer at the very close here. But this pretty much wraps us up, but.
I would just say thank you to everybody. Thank you to SCSP. Yep.
Thank you to Eli Sugarman standing over in the corner there. Thank you to SCSP, say that 10 times fast, for making this happen. But thank you to everybody on the panel, for everybody for participating. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Lots to do. Thank you.
Yeah.